of Jesus Christ, predicting the fall of Jerusalem, the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 9 and Daniel's prophecy, and how every detail was worked out, and how did everything it was worked out in advance long before it was ever prophesied. And we're going to come to Matthew chapter 21, verse 38, and we're going to take a look at another very interesting parable of the vineyard. Jesus was speaking in parables because if he came out in plain speech, they would have murdered him on the spot. And his hour had not yet come, so they weren't going to murder him yet. So he had to speak in parables so that he could disguise the truth in a way that those who would read it later, such as you and I tonight, could see what he was talking about. And when we look at prophecy and history, we can see what he was talking about. These prophecies had to be fulfilled so that they, in the immediate context of what Jesus was talking about. If these prophecies were not fulfilled then, if there was a postponement of all of this, then Jesus is a liar. Jesus is not a true prophet. When a prophet spoke, it had to come to pass. So if everything that Jesus is saying didn't come to pass, then we have the wrong Savior. We have the wrong Messiah. What Jesus said had to come to pass. It's 2,000 years now. You mean to tell me that what Jesus said has taken 2,000 years to come to pass? That is preposterous. There's no way in the world that Jesus could be a prophet, high priest, and a king if his prophecies failed. So he's talking to these people in that generation. And that these things would happen to those people in that generation. And that many of them would be alive when that happened, the second generation. And so in Matthew 21, he disguises the whole historical episode with this parable. It's a very interesting parable, very pointed, very poignant. Look at it. Matthew 21, look at it. And what's going on here? Verse 38. He says here, listen, verse 33. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a vine press in it and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. And when the harvest time approached, he sent his slaves to the vineyard to receive his produce. And the vineyard growers, they took his slaves and beat one and killed another and stoned a third. Beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Again, he sent another group of slaves, larger than the first, and they did the same thing to him. But afterward he sent his son, saying, they will respect my son. That touches my heart. Afterward he sent his son and said, surely they'll respect my son. Surely they'll do honor and homage to my son. I'm the owner of this vineyard. They don't own it. I'm just renting it out to them. How could they possibly have the audacity to hurt my son? But when the vineyard owners saw the son, the growers, they said among themselves, this is the heir. By all the signs and wonders and miracles that he did, he proved indisputably that he was the Son of God. Beyond doubt. They could find no sin in him. They could find no spot in him. They said, he is the heir, we know. And believe it or not, even though they knew, they said, let's kill him and seize his inheritance. And they took him and cast him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine growers? The same thing he asked before in the Gospel of Luke. He said, you judge for yourselves. You people who are rejecting me, let's hear what you have to say. And they judged themselves. Not only did God judge them, not only did their own conscience judge them, and not only did Jesus judge them with this parable, but by their own answer they judged themselves. They said to him, he will bring those wretches. And when they called them wretches, they were calling themselves wretches. Wretched, disrespectable, insolent sons of Satan, and bring them to a wretched end, and will rent out the vineyard to another vine grower who will pay him the proceeds at the proper season. That's you people, Gentiles, those of you who have accepted Christ from Germany, from India, from China, from Korea, from North and South America, from Canada, from Indonesia, from Madagascar, from Japan. Those of you who have accepted Jesus Christ from Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, Finland, the Scandinavian countries, Great Britain, Spain, and France, and Portugal, those of you who have heard the gospel and accepted Christ, you're the ones who have the vineyard. You're going to pay your tithe. You're going to pay your offering. And most of all, you're going to give your lives as a wholehearted sacrificial offering against which there is no lie. And they're going to pay the proceeds in proper season. And Jesus said to them, did you not read in the Scriptures the stone which the builders rejected? This became the chief cornerstone. And thus came about from the Lord. It is a marvelous thing in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you Jews. Those of you who thought that David and Solomon and all of your great glory, you were so great. I tell you, it's going to be taken away from you. It's going to be given to the great people of Great Britain. It's going to be given to the Germanic tribes. It's going to be given to the people in Indonesia. It's going to be given to the people in China and Japan. It's going to be given to the people in North and South America and the United States of America. They're going to be given to a nation producing the fruit of it. And who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces. But on whosoever it falls, it will scatter him like dust. I'm telling you that King Jesus Christ, the center column of all history, is that if we fall upon Jesus Christ, we will be saved. But if the stone falls upon us, we will be lost. Jesus is the rock. He will either be the rock upon which we fall, or the rock will fall upon us. We'll either be crushed by Jesus Christ, or we'll be saved by Jesus Christ. And when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard this parable, they understood that he was speaking about them. They got together and they put their heads together. They stroked their beards and they scratched their heads and they said, we think he's talking about us. We think he's talking about us. And he was talking about them. And when they sought to seize him, they became afraid of the multitude because they held him to be a prophet. And Jesus Christ is prophet. He is high priest. He is king. When he says something, it has to come to pass. You can't allow 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years. You can't allow that to pass under the bridge. When Jesus says something, it has got to come to pass. This abomination. Abomination means to pollute and profane and blaspheme everything that God considers to be holy. And when Titus went into that city, his soldiers began to ransack the temple, and they took the golden candelabra, they took the golden candlesticks, they took all of the golden trumpets, they took all of the inlaid tables that were inlaid with gold, the Ark of the Covenant. They took everything out of the temple, and they carried it away, and they offered it unto Jupiter Capitolinus. They offered it unto Mars, unto Zeus, unto all their foreign gods. They were ignorant heathens. They didn't know who God was, and they offered it to Zeus and other gods, and profaned everything. And God looked upon the Jews and said, you have profaned my holy name. Now these people will profane your temple. It is your house. It's not my house. They can have all the gold, all the silver, everything in that house is theirs. Let Titus and the Romans enrich their coffers with all of that wealth, because it's your house. It's not my house anymore. And so they took all of the wealth, and they plundered, and they raped, and they ransacked the city. Now, all of this was prophesied in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Daniel said that Moses spoke of all of these things. Moses said that it would happen. And in Deuteronomy 28 and verse 68, we have a long-distance prophecy that God saw this coming about long before it ever happened. Moses in Deuteronomy, God was speaking to Moses, and he told those Jews, he said, if you hearken unto my word, he said, I'll bless you. He said, I'll bless you in the city, I'll bless you in the country, I'll bless you in your industry, I'll bless the offspring of your breast, in verse 4. Deuteronomy 28, but the Lord will cause your enemy to rise up against you, in verse 7, and you'll defeat your enemy. In other words, you'll be successful in industry, in military. Your domestic product will be successful. There'll be domestic tranquility. You'll have a wonderful kingdom if you just listen to what I have to say. But he says, if you don't listen to what I have to say in verse 15, if you don't obey the Lord God and observe the commandments of God, he said, all these curses shall come upon you in your city, verse 16. And in your basket, and kneading bread, verse 17. Your children will be cursed, in verse 18. And the Lord will bring curses upon you, in verse 20. Curses, confusion, rebuke. And all you undertake to do until you're destroyed. You will be destroyed. And you will perish quickly from the earth on account of the evil of your deeds, because you've forsaken me. I'm telling you, it's going to happen. And the Lord will make the pestilence cling to you until it's consumed you from the land where you are entering to possess it. When Titus surrounded the city and put up the siege works, and the people couldn't get out to get food and water, and they began to eat each other, cannibalism, bestiality, homosexuality, all kind of evil sins began to reign rampant inside that city. They became beasts instead of human beings. They turned into monsters. And because of their sexual sins, in verse 22, the Lord will smite you with consumption and with fever, with inflammation, with fiery heat, and with the sword, and the blight, and mildew, and they shall pursue you until you perish. And the heavens which are over your head shall be bronze. You can cry out to God. You might just as well cry out to a ceiling of bronze, brass, and iron. And the Lord will make the rain of your land powder and dust come down upon you. The Lord will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. And if you look at the next slide there, you'll see that the enemy will come and your carcasses will be food for the birds in verse 26. And Titus the emperor came, and here we see an angel over the head of Titus. And that angel is actually guiding the enemy of God's people, leading him and giving him triumph after triumph, victory after victory. The Jews didn't stand a chance. Look at the next slide there. After Titus came into the city, he made slaves out of them. Deuteronomy 28 said that would happen. The Lord will smite you in verse 27 with boils of Egypt. Now we're looking at a herpes virus type of disease, an acquired syndrome, AIDS disease, where it was called botch in Egypt. It came from worshiping sex and the sexual parts of the body. And fetishism, they called it. And the Egyptians had perfected fetishism until they even worshiped dead corpses and dead bodies. And they would even have sexual relationships with a mummy. And as a result of this, they contacted all kinds of diseases. And all of these are sexually transmitted diseases. In verse 27, hemorrhoids with the scab and the itch from which you cannot be healed. The Lord will smite you with madness, with blindness. When we have herpes complex, it affects, it causes cervical cancer. When the herpes complex travels to the brain, it'll cause madness, sleeplessness. At first, when people contact AIDS, they begin to sneeze and blast. And he says here that you'll group at noon like a blind man groups in the darkness, and you shall not prosper in your ways. And you'll never be healed. There'll never be a cure for these sexually transmitted diseases. Penicillin won't touch them. You just have to live with it. The scab, the itch, the hemorrhoid, and the blasting, which is the sneezing. At first they thought that it was a Kaposi sarcoma, which is a disease that affects the lungs, and tuberculosis. But it's far worse than that. And you'll group at noon, which means you'll get up in the morning and hate yourself. You want to crawl out of your skin, and you'll go to bed at night and still be in the same condition you were in the morning. All because that your sins have found you out. And what we're seeing here is Dr. Keith Wise, who lectured here in Harrisonburg a few years ago. He wrote a book on Not One Stone. And he said that when that city was under siege and the people started turning against each other, and bands of raiders would parade the streets and they would rape and kill and plunder, even little children, and they would vandalize the temple. They desolated the temple. The Jews themselves desolated the temple. In fact, Titus didn't want to desolate the temple. He instructed his soldiers and said, don't destroy that temple. That temple's a masterpiece. That temple's one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. It's one of the wonders of the world. It's an architectural masterpiece. It would be a shame to destroy such a beautiful work of art as that temple. And yet the Jews themselves went into the temple and began to destroy it, and they actually helped to set it on fire. And then when the soldiers saw the Jews themselves had no respect for their own temple, then Titus' soldiers, against his own protest, ran in there and began to abuse and blaspheme and destroy and profane the temple. They were just like a bunch of ox in a china closet. He says in verse 35, the Lord will strike you on the knees and the legs with boils, from which you cannot be healed, from the soles of your feet to the crown of your head. The Lord will bring you and your king, whom you shall over you, to a nation which neither you nor your fathers have known. And there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone. You're going to be dispersed. You're going to intermarry with the others. The Romans are going to rape your women, and your children are going to be half-breeds. There'll be no more pure Jews anymore. No more temple records anymore. No way to prove that you're a Jew anymore. Judaism is gone. And in verse 37, you shall become a horror and a proverb and a taunt among all the people where the Lord will drive you, because the word Jew that was held in high esteem now will become a byword, a proverb. It will be used in ignominy, in scorn, as a taunt. And you shall bring out much seed to the field, but you shall gather in little. And then it goes on to say that the alien who is among you in verse 43 shall rise above you. And then it goes on to say that because you did not keep the commandments of God, verse 45, curses shall come upon you. And they shall become a sign and a wonder on you and your descendants forever. A sign and a wonder. I'm here tonight to tell you about a sign and a wonder. I'm here to tell you something that happened that should make your hair stand on end. It happened in history. All you got to do is get your computer, punch in Titus, punch in abomination, desolation, punch in 70 AD, and everything that I'm saying, plus a million other thoughts will come from that period in history when God made a sign and a wonder and a spectacle of the Jews that he loved so much. In verse 49, the Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from as far away as Britain. The Roman legions came, and they were hungry, and they were ready for the booty. They were looking for prey, and they came from afar, from Germany. As an eagle swoops down, the emblem of the Roman soldier was the eagle. And the Roman soldier had an eagle, and they offered their offerings to the eagle, which was an eagle was an unclean bird. And yet this nation, this whole language, you should not understand. They couldn't understand the Roman language. The Latin language. They couldn't understand the Germanic language. They couldn't understand the British language. All they knew is that these aliens were coming into their city, a nation of fierce countenance, who shall have no respect for the old, nor show favor to the young. Moreover, it shall eat the offspring of your herd and the produce of your ground. They ate up the whole produce of Jerusalem. And it also says that they will eat the offspring of your own body, the flesh of your sons and your daughters, whom the Lord your God has given you during the siege. There's going to be a siege. Never were the Jews ever sieged like this as they were by Titus, and the distress by which your enemy shall oppose you. Now, in verse 54, there's a woman referred to here. What's her name, John?
Mary of Bethzuba.
Okay, say that again. Mary
Of Bethzuba.
Bethzuba.
Yes.
Mary of Bethzuba. Josephus, when recording the woman who ate her baby, gave her name. And Mary of Bethzuba. And in verse 54, the man who was refined and very delicate among you shall be hostile toward his brothers and toward his wife. He shall cherish and toward the rest of his children who remain, so that he will not give even one of them any of the flesh of his own children, which he shall eat. In this siege, they were eating their children, and they were so greedy as they ate the flesh of their own children that a man wouldn't even give a piece of the flesh, a part of the thigh or the leg of a child to his own children. That's how wicked they were. They were such reprobates. And that's why even the Gentiles said there can be no more wickedness on the world than like this, during the siege and the distress by which your enemies shall oppose you in all your towns. Verse 55. The refined and delicate woman, this is Mary of Bathsheba, who would not venture to set the sole of her foot on the ground for delicateness and refinement, shall be hostile toward the husband she cherishes and toward her son and daughter. Now, here is a refined woman, kind of woman you take to a country club, delicate, refined, well-dressed, an aristocratic woman, and now her afterbirth. She gives birth to a baby, verse 57, which issues from between her legs and toward her children, whom she bears, for she shall eat them secretly for lack of anything else. Now, when the Romans broke into Mary's house, they found that there was the smell of flesh. And the Jews were coming in because they said, there's food here. There's food here. And so the Romans watched them all come into that house, and there was the baby under a blanket. Part of its body had been eaten, and part of it was still there. And the Roman soldiers actually got nauseated when they saw this. They were so taken and appalled at this Mary eating her own baby. And when the Jews came in like animals, they began to devour that little baby as if it was just another pork chop, just another piece of meat. That, brothers and sisters, was all prophesied in detail long before it ever happened. Now, I talked about how the cholera and diseases began to spread in the city, and how their bodies got bloated, and they began to have herpes sores and other diseases from sexual relationships, because everything went. There was nothing. It was like Las Vegas, San Francisco. It was like you wouldn't believe, all put together. The hellhole of the world was in Jerusalem, the worst place you could be. And so after they killed 2 million of them, took almost 1,100,000 people captive, they took 7,000 of them back to Egypt in ships. They said, we'll sell them as slaves. They took them to Egypt in ships. And when those Jews got off the ship, went back to Egypt. Now remember, it was in Egypt that this nation was born. It was in Egypt that God raised up Moses. It was in Egypt that God led them out through the wilderness and made a great out of them. Now they're not a nation anymore. Now they're going back to Egypt. And instead of going back to Egypt victoriously, they're going back as a bunch of slaves. Slaves being taken, men, women, boys, girls. And in verse 68, the Lord will bring you back to Egypt in ships by the way which I spoke to you. You will never see it again. God said, you're going to leave Egypt, but now you're going to go back to Egypt, and there you shall be offered as for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. No one will bid on you, because you are such a pitiful sight of a human being as a result of that siege. All of that's prophesied. Matthew Henry said that nothing can prove the divine legacy and the inspiration of the Scriptures more than the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. Matthew Henry quoted this Deuteronomy 28, and he said that a man who was an effeminate man, a man who loved women more than he loved women, tore the Bible up, tore these pages out of the Bible, because he didn't even want to read the record. It was so strong. And Matthew Henry has a record of that in his comments on Deuteronomy 28. So the slaves were taken back to Egypt, and that no one wanted them because that they were so bloated and that they were so emasculated and they were so pale. Now, if we look at the next one, we're going to notice here this beautiful temple that was set on fire, that was destroyed, one of the masterpieces of the world. And when the Jews went in there, they said, we're safe right here. As long as we're here, we know that God will protect us. And they had false prophets going among the people saying, get into the city. And all the surrounding towns, they emptied themselves and went into the city. And they barricaded themselves inside the city. And they said that God will certainly honor his holy temple, God will certainly honor his holy promise. The Jews are his special people. Nothing will befall us. Stay in the city. And the false prophets then gave false prophecy, because the worst place that you could have been on the face of God's earth was in that city in 70 A.D. Now, we look at the first Jewish revolt here, how it all started. It took 3.5 years, the next one. The first Jewish revolt, the war actually acted from 66 to 73 A.D. In 66 A.D., Caesarea, in the center of the map right there, at the top you'll see Caesarea. It was a seacoast town, and the Jews wanted to know if they had equal standing with the Gentiles. And the Caesar in Rome said, no, you Jews do not have equal standing with the Gentiles. So the Gentiles then, realizing that Rome was behind them, they killed birds. And these birds, when they offer a bird, it's a sign of leprosy. And they killed birds according to the Jewish custom and took them up to the temple steps and offered them on the steps of the synagogue. That offended the Jews greatly, because to offer birds was saying to the Jews that you're a bunch of lepers. You're the lepers of the empire. So then, it offended the Jews. The Romans then killed 20,000 Jews in 1 hour. Then the Jews slaughtered Roman soldiers at Jerusalem. Even though the Roman soldiers surrendered, they still slaughtered them. So a great civil war was started in 66. 2,500 Jews were killed in one day, 2,300 Jews were killed another day, and then the Pharisees became zealots. A zealot was one who wanted to overthrow the Roman Empire. So now you have a war going on between Rome and Jerusalem. The priests no longer sacrificed to Caesar. That made Caesar mad. They were ready for war. The governor of Syria, his name was Cestius Gallus, and he had 12 legions called the Thundering Herd. He was sent by the Caesar to go to the temple. When he went to the temple, they swung the gates open, and Cestius came in with his troops, the Thundering Herd, and all the Jews began to wave palm leaves, and they all began to welcome him as if he were a great conqueror. And so Cestius fell for the ploy as if they were going to just surrender. And so he retreated. Now, had he stayed there, he would have defeated the Jews. The war would have been over. But because the Jews welcomed him so greatly, he took his 12 legions and he left. And he went as far as Beth Horon. Well, when he left, some of the renegade Jews says, look, we believe that just as Judas Maccabees was successful in the in-between the Testament, and it was at Beth Horon that Judas Maccabees had his final victory over the enemy, that this is an omen to us that we're going to beat these Roman soldiers. So they began to send out bandits and robbers, and they began to throw darts at Cestius and his Roman soldiers. He was a Syrian, but he was a commander of Roman soldiers. And they began to throw spears at him. And they were very cowardly. They wouldn't come out and fight openly, but they would hide in the bushes and hide behind embankments. And at nighttime, when the Romans were sleeping, they would come in and attack them. And so when Cestius got about 3 days' journey outside of the city of Jerusalem, he stopped at Beth Horon, and he said, what a fool I have been to have allowed those Jews to trick me. And so this sent vibrations through his camp. Longinus, who was his chief recorder, was put to death. Another one of his great leaders, one of his commanders, was put to death. And the Jews were just nipping at his heels like a bunch of pack of wild dogs. And he became so mad, so furious, that when his soldiers went back to Jerusalem, they were in a bloodthirsty rage. Now, there were several things that happened during this period of time that gave the Christian Jews ample time to repent. They could have said, Jesus told us this was going to happen. We're going to have to get out of the city. When Cestius came, that was an omen to the Christian Jews. that it was time to get out of the city and flee to the mountains of Judea. But now we're seeing that there's a great hostility that is building up toward the Jews because of the way they treated the governor of Syria and his thundering herd. Josephus says that when he went back, he was so angry that they called in reinforcements. Titus came, and altogether 1.1 million Jews died, Josephus said. 2,000 committed suicide. 97,000 Jews were able to get out of the place. But the Jews thought it was the end of the world. Vespasian destroyed Galilee, Judea, Idumea. The Edomites joined the Jews and fought together against the Romans, but the Romans destroyed both the Edomites and the Jews. In 68 A.D., Vespasian attacked Jerusalem. God usually protects Jerusalem, but not now. And then Nero died, and his son went back home. Now this is important, because when Nero died and his son went back home, in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus says that when they put the siege up against the city, he says that you see this abomination of desolation. He says in verse 16, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. All this is happening. The thundering herd becoming enraged. Titus Vespasian attacking in 68 A.D. Flee to the mountains in verse 16. Now this cannot be something happening today, because no one's going to flee to the mountains of Judea today. We won't even know where the mountains of Judea are. Let him who was on the housetop not go down to get the things that are in his house, verse 17. In those days, they lived on the housetop at nighttime. They didn't have air conditioning, and so they go up there in the coolness of the evening and try to shade themselves. But he said, if you're up on that housetop, don't you come back into the house. You won't have time. Get out. And let him who's in the field not turn back to get a cloak. Don't even put a cloak on. In those days, they had a long cloak. That was their apparel. That all happened in that day. In Judea, in that day. When people wore cloaks, in that day. When people were up on top of their houses, in that day. Woe to those who are with child and to those who nurse babies in those days. Those days. Looking back. Now, today a woman nursing a baby would have no problem. She'd have a car to jump into. She could carry her baby with her. Some women don't even nurse babies today. They use formula to feed their babies. So, but in those days, all women had to nurse their babies. Pray that your flight not be on the winter. Okay, well, who cares if it's in the winter today? I got a four-wheel drive. How many of you have four-wheel drives? Anybody have a four-wheel drive? Winter's not going to stop you. All you got to do is get in your four-wheel drive. But in that day, winter was pretty bad. Okay? For there will be great tribulation, verse 21. Now, most people say, oh, the great tribulation is going to come in someday in the future, right? But what did Jesus say?